What if one morning, your manhood just stops working because someone used Juju witchcraft in your underwear? Scary, right? Nina and David grew up on the same street. From the time they were 5, they were always together. They went to school, hand in hand, ate lunch from the same plate, and played hide and seek until the stars filled the sky. Everyone in the neighborhood knew. Where Nina was, David was close by. But what no one knew was that Nina loved David, not just as a friend, not like a brother. She loved him the way girls dream about princes in books. Deep in her heart, she believed, one day, he would love her too. As they grew older, Nina stayed close. She was always there. When David got sick, she was by his side. When he passed exams, she was the first to cheer. When he cried the day his dog died, she hugged him all night. To David, Nina was his best friend, his safe place. To Nina, David was her everything. She never told him how she felt. She thought, if she just waited, he would feel the same. She believed love didn't need to be rushed. One day he would look at her and say, "Nina, you're the one." She waited and waited until one day, everything broke. It happened on a Friday. David was acting differently, smiling at his phone, laughing softly, hiding something. Nina noticed. She noticed everything about him. That evening she followed him quietly. Just a little, just enough to see where he was going. And then she saw it. David, sitting at a cafe, holding hands with another girl. A beautiful girl with long curly hair and shiny lip gloss. He was laughing the same way he laughed with Nina, looking at this girl the way Nina had always dreamed of. Something broke inside her. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, shaking. Her heart didn't just hurt. It burned. That night, Nina didn't sleep. She lay on her bed, eyes wide open, whispering over and over, "He was supposed to be mine. Mine." She wasn't going to lose him. Not to some girl with shiny hair. Not after all those years. Not after all the love she gave. Nina made a decision. If she couldn't have David the normal way, she would find another way. Nina couldn't stop thinking. She stopped eating, stopped talking. Every second her head screamed, "David is mine. He's supposed to be mine." She tried texting him. He didn't reply. She tried calling. He said he was busy. But Nina knew. He was with her, the other girl. Days passed. Nina searched online. How to make someone love you. How to break couples apart. Spiritual ways to keep your soulmate. Most of it looked fake, until she saw a post written in pidgin English. It read, "Tie am with red thread. Use him cloth. If you sew it right, he go belong to you alone." Nina's heart skipped. She read every word carefully. It talked about a Juju ritual called thread locking. A special magic done by sewing red thread into the underwear of someone you love. But it had to be real, and it had to be done by someone who knew the rules. So Nina went to the one person she had heard whispers about, Mama If. She lived in a quiet corner of the city, behind a broken-down salon. Everyone called her an auntie, but no one really knew her age. Some said she was 60. Others swore she hadn't aged in 30 years. Nina waited at the door. When Mama If opened it, she didn't smile. She stared, deep, like she was reading Nina's thoughts. "You want him to stay," Mama If said softly. "You want him to forget the other girl." Nina nodded. Her hands trembled. "You sure?" Mama If asked. "Because once this begins, you can't go back. Love by Juju is not love. It is control." "I'm sure," Nina whispered. Tears filled her eyes. I just want him to be mine. Mama, I've handed her a red thread, a silver needle, and a small white powder in a paper wrap. Steal his underwear, she said. Sew the thread into the center. As you sew, whisper, tie his soul, his body, his desire, to me and me alone. Then sprinkle this powder on it and hide it under your bed. Nina took it all. Her heart was racing. She didn't care about rules. She didn't care about warnings. She just wanted David. The next night, when David came over to return a book, he left his bag on her bed for 2 minutes. That's all she needed. She found one of his boxes, locked her door, took out the thread, and began to sew. Each stitch was slow, careful, whispered. Tie his soul, his body, his desire, to me and me alone. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking, but her face was smiling. David would be hers, forever. It started 2 nights later. David was out with his new girlfriend. They were laughing, sitting close, holding hands like nothing else mattered. But the moment he leaned in to kiss her, something strange happened. His body froze. Pain hit him like a slap. He stood up, gasping for air. His hands shook, his stomach twisted. Then he rushed to the bathroom. That's when he saw it. Blood. It wasn't from a wound. There was no cut, no injury. But his manhood was bleeding. He stared at the blood, frozen in shock. His heartbeat raced. He washed himself over and over, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. He told his girlfriend it was nothing. Just stress. Maybe a health issue. But the fear in her eyes said everything. She didn't believe him. She felt something was wrong. And slowly, she began to pull away. The next day, David stayed home. He searched the internet looking for answers. Was it an infection? A disease? A curse? He couldn't find anything that made sense. He called Nina. She answered immediately. Her voice was soft, caring. "Are you okay?" she asked. He didn't tell her the truth. He just said, "I don't feel right." And Nina smiled quietly, holding the red-threaded boxers under her bed. Over the next few days, it got worse. Every time David tried to be intimate with his girlfriend, his body shut down. The pain returned. The bleeding grew heavier. Sometimes it came with shaking. His fingers curled. His eyes rolled, like a seizure. His girlfriend was terrified. She cried the last time it happened. Then she said the words that broke him. "I can't do this anymore." She left. No calls, no messages, nothing. David sat in his room for hours, alone, ashamed, confused. He started having nightmares. He saw red thread wrapped around his waist, cutting into his skin. In one dream, someone was sewing him shut, stitch by stitch. He couldn't scream. He couldn't move. When he woke up, his bed was soaked with sweat and blood. That morning, Nina showed up with a bowl of hot soup. She walked in like the perfect friend. He looked at her like she was his last light. "I don't know what's happening to me," he whispered. "I feel like I'm breaking." Nina sat beside him, gently rubbing his back. But the moment her hand touched his thigh, his body jerked, his breath caught, his arms shook, and then his nose started bleeding. He collapsed, gasping. And in that moment, Nina realized this wasn't love anymore. This was something much darker. Nina couldn't sleep that night. She sat on her bed, holding the red-threaded boxes in her hands. Her fingers shook as she stared at what she had sewn. She never meant to hurt him. She just wanted him to stay, to choose her, to love her the way she loved him. But now, he was suffering, bleeding, breaking, and it was all because of her. The next morning, Nina rushed to Mama If's door. She banged hard. The old woman opened slowly, eyes calm, like she had been expecting her. "I want to undo it," Nina said. Her voice cracked. "He's in pain. Something's wrong. It's not working the way you said." Mama If looked at her, then walked back inside without a word. Nina followed. The air inside smelled like ashes and dust. Candles flickered near a small wooden altar. Mama If sat on the floor and said, softly, "I warned you. Juju isn't love. It's power. And power always has a price." Nina dropped to her knees. "I'll do anything. Just help me fix it." The woman stared at her. "There are only 2 ways," she said. 1, you leave him forever. Move far away. Never touch him again. The bond will fade in time. 2, you stay close, but carry the curse with him. That means every time he suffers, you suffer too. Nina's heart sank. She had to choose between watching him suffer alone or suffering beside him forever. That night, she went to David's house. He was lying in bed, weak and pale. His eyes were half open, his lips dry, his voice low. "You're the only one who still checks on me," he whispered. I think I love you." Those words stabbed her in the heart, because now, finally he wanted her. But not because of real love, because the Juju had broken everything else. She reached out to hold his hand, but the moment her skin touched his body jerked violently, his back arched, his fingers curled. He gasped for air. And then, again. Blood. His shirt turned red. Nina pulled her hand back, crying now. "No," she whispered, "please, not again." She ran home, threw the boxes into a bowl, lit a match, but they wouldn't burn. She tried to cut the thread. The scissors snapped in her hand. It was alive. The Juju was alive. Nina fell to the floor, shaking. This wasn't a love story anymore. This was a prison. And now, she had one last thing to do. She would confess. She would tell David the truth, even if it destroyed everything. The rain wouldn't stop. It poured over the windows as Nina stood outside David's apartment. Her clothes were soaked. Her heart felt even heavier. She had made her choice. She couldn't run anymore. She couldn't watch him bleed. She had to tell him the truth, even if it broke his heart. She knocked. David opened the door slowly. He looked tired, weaker than before. But his eyes lit up when he saw her. "You came back," he whispered. Nina stepped inside, water dripping from her clothes. Her hands trembled. "David," she began, "there's something I need to tell you. Please listen. Don't say anything. Just hear me out." He sat down quietly. She stood in front of him, fingers shaking, eyes filled with tears. "I've always loved you," she said, "since we were kids. Since we used to run barefoot on the street and chase butterflies. I thought one day you'd love me too." David didn't speak. He just stared at her. Nina took a deep breath. "But when I saw you with her, when I saw you holding someone else, something broke inside me." She paused. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I went to someone, a woman. She gave me a thread, a red thread. She told me if I sewed it into something that belonged to you, you'd love me back." David blinked slowly. "I took your underwear," she said. "I sewed the thread into it. I whispered words over it. I did Juju on you." Silence filled the room. David didn't move. His chest rose and fell, his face frozen like a statue. Tears streamed down Nina's cheeks. "I didn't know it would hurt you," she cried. "I didn't know you'd bleed. I didn't know it would go this far." She knelt beside him, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I ruined everything. I ruined you." David still didn't speak. Then, slowly, he stood up. He walked to the window, stared into the rain. His back was turned, his shoulders stiff. Nina stood too. "David, say something, please." He turned around. His eyes were full of something she had never seen before. Not love, not hate, something in between. "I need time," he said quietly. Then he walked past her and closed the door to his room, leaving her alone, in the dark, with the sound of rain and her heartbeat echoing in the silence. Have you heard about Juju witchcraft before? If yes, comment below your thoughts about it.